On April 12, 1945, at 3:35 p.m., Franklin D. Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage while vacationing in Warm Springs, Georgia. He had been president for 12 years, longer than anyone in history, so long that many Americans could barely remember another president. And he had led the United States through its greatest economic crisis, the Great Depression, and through World War II, the most destructive conflict in world history. 4 times, the American people entrusted him with the nation's highest office in those critical years, something they had never done with anyone else. The United States had been at war for 3.5 years. In Europe, American and Soviet armies were closing in on Berlin. Nazi Germany was being dismantled inch by inch. American military officials were predicting that the war in Europe would be over in 6 months. In the Pacific, American forces were engaged in brutal combat with the Japanese in the Philippines and in Okinawa. Hundreds of American B-29s were striking the Japanese homeland with incendiary bombs, killing and burning to death what would eventually become hundreds of thousands of people. Still, there were few signs of a Japanese surrender. Military planners were predicting the fighting in Asia to last another year and a half. At the highest levels, the United States had been coordinating with Great Britain, led by Winston Churchill, and the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, to defeat the Axis powers. As we covered in episodes 5 and 6, Roosevelt had met with Churchill and Stalin at Yalta back in February 1945 to finalize plans to end the war and to shape the post-war world. Since then, the Soviets were imposing their grip over Eastern Europe, including Poland. Stalin promised free elections in Poland, but in the months since, he had installed a pro-Soviet regime and had no intention of honoring his commitments. Some Americans began fearing that, once the war ended, a new conflict between the West and the Soviet Union was inevitable. This was where the world stood on April 12, 1945, at the climax of one conflict and at the dawn of another, between 2 unprecedented global struggles. But the one man the country trusted was gone. FDR was now dead. The man who now faced these challenges was Roosevelt's vice president, a 60-year-old man named Harry S. Truman. He had been vice president for just 82 days. He was added to the ticket for Roosevelt's 4th term. He had virtually no foreign policy experience, and few Americans knew his name. And he was frightened. He wasn't quite sure he was up for the task. But he was the man destiny had chosen to lead the country at this critical time. How he responded to this challenge is the story of this episode of This American President. Little past 7 o'clock, about 2 hours after Franklin Roosevelt was dead, Truman was in the cabinet room of the White House. As he stood by his wife, Bess, and his daughter, Margaret, surrounded by cabinet and military officials, he took the oath of office as the 33rd President of the United States. He was now the commander-in-chief of the greatest military force the world had ever seen. 16 million men and women, 27 carriers, 10 battleships, and countless planes, tanks, and guns. FDR's death was a shock to the nation. Millions of Americans wondered whether America could go on without him, especially now with so much at stake. And even worse, how could this Truman fellow measure up? We in 2019 might find this overdramatic, but that's because we know the outcome. We know that the Allies would go on to win, that the war would end in just a few more months. But no one at the time knew how things would play out. Some feared that FDR's death could breathe new life into the Axis powers. Some believed that the war could be prolonged, and millions more might be killed. Historian David McCullough wrote that, quote, "To many it was not just that the greatest of men had fallen, but that the least of men, or at any rate the least likely of men, had assumed his place." Harry Truman was placed onto the ticket because the leaders of the Democratic Party didn't like the previous vice president, Henry Wallace. Not necessarily because of anything remarkable about Harry Truman. You can learn more about that in episodes 5 and 6 of our podcast. There seemed to be something absurd about the whole thing. Most presidents are chosen after a long election cycle in which the country has a chance to size up the candidates. When there's an international crisis, The candidate's abilities become even more important. But no one really cares about the vice presidency. When people voted for Roosevelt and Truman in the 1944 election, they were really just voting for Roosevelt. But in electing him, they inadvertently put Truman in the position to become president during this crucial time. And it didn't help that FDR didn't prepare him at all for the job. He didn't include him in any war strategy meetings or any other meetings. General George Patton lamented, quote, "It seems very unfortunate that in order to secure political preference, people are made vice president who are never intended by party nor by the Lord to be presidents." Truman himself was among those doubters. To reporters, Truman said, quote, "There have been few men in all of history the equal of the man into whose shoes I am stepping. I pray God I can measure up to the task." Later that day, more candidly, he told the press, quote, "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. I don't know if you fellows ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me yesterday what had happened, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." Just who was Harry Truman? Well, he came from a very different pedigree than FDR. While Roosevelt was raised in a wealthy, prominent New York family, Truman had far more modest upbringing. He was born in 1884 and raised in Missouri, the son of a farmer. In his youth, Truman learned to play the piano and developed a lifelong fondness for history. He was a voracious reader on anything from ancient Greece to the American Civil War. After graduating high school, he enrolled in college in Kansas City, but left after a year. He then worked a series of random jobs, as a timekeeper at a railway, where he slept in camps for hobos, in the mailroom of a newspaper, and as a bank clerk. Although he studied for a little while in law school, he quit school altogether. He was the last American president to not have a college degree. Truman joined the National Guard, and when America entered World War I, he became the captain of an artillery regiment that was sent to France in 1918. It was there that Truman first exhibited the qualities that would mark his tenure as president: tenacity and leadership. He transformed his unit into an effective fighting force, and they performed admirably while enduring intense combat during the war. He was a feisty leader. While at the Vosges Mountains in France, he and his soldiers came under heavy German fire. When his men started fleeing, Truman unleashed a foul-mouthed tirade that stopped them in their tracks and got them back to fighting. In another instance, he led an attack on the Germans that saved many lives in the U.S. Army's 28th Infantry Division. These were critical experiences in his life, giving him confidence as he pursued a career in public service. When he returned home, he courted a woman named Bess Wallace, who he had known since he was 6 and she was 5. He proposed to her in 1911, but she turned him down. He was persistent, and they finally married in 1919. They eventually had one daughter named Margaret. Soon, Truman went into business and opened up a haberdashery, basically a store that sells men's clothing and accessories. Unfortunately, this venture failed when the economy tanked in the early 20s. Truman was bankrupt, but he caught the eye of a local party boss named Tom Pendergast, who was looking for a candidate for public office. While most people didn't see much in Truman, to Pendergast, he was an ideal candidate, a veteran who was known for hard work and honesty. He convinced Truman to run for county judge in eastern Jackson County in 1922, basically being a county supervisor. He won the election. Thus, Harry Truman began his political career. Although Pendergast was a typical political boss, seen by many as corrupt and power-hungry, Truman got a reputation for competence and integrity. He adopted political views in the tradition of Jacksonian democracy, fighting for the interests of rural citizens and common folks against the corrupt establishment. This helped him get elected a U.S. Senator in 1934. Truman arrived in Washington at the start of the Roosevelt administration, as it was implementing its New Deal policies to deal with the Depression. Truman was a loyal Democrat and supported many of FDR's programs. But it was during World War II when Truman really made a name for himself. He was appointed to chair a special Senate investigative committee, which became known as the Truman Committee, to investigate wasteful defense spending. According to some estimates, the Truman Committee saved the taxpayers about $15 billion, or about $210 billion in today's dollars. By 1944, Harry Truman was 60 years old. Although he was well respected among his colleagues, most Americans didn't know anything about him. He likely would have retired as an obscure political figure had it not been for the events at the 1944 Democratic Convention. That year, FDR was running for his fourth term, but he was a sick man. In fact, his doctor told him he would likely not survive a fourth term, especially given the strain of running the war effort. And it showed. Anyone who saw FDR by then already knew that he was in poor health. He was too thin for his clothes. His jaw often hung open, and his skin was pale gray. Democratic Party leaders had a hunch that he would die in office. The problem was that the incumbent vice president was a man named Henry Wallace, who was far too liberal for most of the party, and who was a bit of an oddball. He had a history of engaging in spiritual mysticism and had poor political skills. He was often feuding with other members of the administration. But Wallace was popular with the liberal rank and file, and during the convention, there was a push to renominate him for vice president, but the party bosses engineered for him to be removed from the ticket. In his place, they found someone with few enemies, Harry Truman. The evidence indicates that Truman hadn't sought the office, but fate had other plans. The Roosevelt-Truman ticket won that November, and Harry Truman became vice president in January 1945. Within 3 months, Roosevelt was dead, and the former haberdasher, a man with no college degree, was the commander-in-chief of the United States during a pivotal moment in world history. The new president now had to confront the growing conflict with Joseph Stalin, a man who had ruled the world's biggest country with an iron fist for about 2 decades. American advisors were getting more concerned about the Soviet Union. By taking over Eastern Europe and installing pro-Soviet regimes in countries like Poland, it was violating the Yalta agreements. Many Americans felt that Roosevelt had been too lenient on Stalin at Yalta. Almost all of Truman's major advisors had served Roosevelt for years and gave Truman different advice on how to handle Stalin. On one side was Averell Harriman, America's ambassador to the Soviet Union. He was wary of Russian aggression and felt the United States might have to resist any expansionist moves, but he also believed that cooperation was still a possibility. After all, the Americans and the Russians had been cooperating for years against the Nazis. It was better to try to continue this cooperation and not rock the boat too much, especially since any daylight between the Allies might encourage Germany or Japan to continue the fight. On the other side was Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who believed that the conflict between America and the Soviets was inevitable. He, therefore, felt the Americans had no time to lose, that we had to confront the Soviets now, before they strengthened their position in Europe. To Secretary of War Henry Stimson and Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, Forrestal's idea was sheer lunacy. After all, Germany and Japan still hadn't surrendered. Those nations still had to be defeated. Did we really want to go to war against the Soviets when the Nazis and the Japanese were still holding out? The Germans might have been on the ropes, but the conflict with Japan was fierce. So fierce that the Americans hoped the Soviets would enter the war against Tokyo. FDR had asked Stalin to enter the Pacific Theater, and Stalin had agreed to do so after the Germans were defeated. American strategists hoped that this would convince the Japanese that they had no chance to win. Perhaps the war could end sooner with Soviet help. Thousands of American lives might be spared. Besides, Stimson felt that the Soviet incursion in Eastern Europe was less about domination and more about establishing a buffer zone for their own security. They had just been invaded by Germany twice in the past 30 years, first during World War I and then during World War II, both times leading to absolute catastrophe and millions of Russian deaths. In Stimson's eyes, it wasn't unreasonable to expect that the Soviets were taking action to prevent another invasion from Europe. These were the immediate decisions that the new inexperienced president faced in his first months in office, decisions that involved the fates of millions of people around the world. On one hand, Truman was being told to stand up to the Soviets, that they were potentially our next adversary. On the other hand, he was told that we needed their help in the war against our current adversaries. If he pushed the Soviets too hard, he might jeopardize the alliance against the Axis powers. And if the Nazis and the Japanese had a sense that the Allies were quarreling with each other, it might encourage them to fight on. It could prolong the war. On the other hand, Allowing the Soviets to impose their will over Eastern Europe could signal to the Soviets that the Americans were unwilling to enforce the Yalta agreements. It could be seen by Stalin as a sign of American weakness and embolden him to undertake further aggression. It could give the Soviets a stronger hand in the post-war world, and it could mean sacrificing the freedom of millions of people to the altar of communism. Isn't that what happened with Hitler? Didn't the West try to appease him in the hopes that he would stop conquering territory and subjugating millions of people under Nazi tyranny? It was quite a dilemma for a former haberdasher. Harry Truman knew he had to walk a tightrope here. He knew he had to maintain the alliance with the Soviets to defeat the Axis, but that he also had to send a message to Stalin. He decided upon a middle course. He would be firm against Moscow and demand that they fulfill their agreements, but not too firm that it would splinter the alliance. He still hoped the Soviets would make good on their promise to enter the war against Japan. Truman had his first chance to apply his new approach at a meeting with the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov on April 23rd. During the meeting, Truman was forceful and called Russia out for breaking the Yalta agreements. Molotov claimed that the Soviets were justified in occupying Poland because the Poles had worked against Russia during the war. In response, Truman scoffed at him, accusing him of just spewing propaganda. Molotov was taken aback by Truman's candor and told him, quote, "I have never been talked to like that in my life." According to Truman, he responded with, quote, "Carry out your agreements and you won't get talked to like that." The new president was setting a new tone for American policy towards the Soviets. 2 days later, on April 25th, Truman had a meeting with Secretary of War Stimson. By then, Stimson was a true elder statesman. He was 77 years old and had his first stint in the cabinet back in 1911, 34 years earlier. He had been Secretary of State under President Hoover and Secretary of War for Presidents Taft and Franklin Roosevelt. He had spent the previous 4 years running the war effort. But this meeting was perhaps the most important one of his entire career. He gave Harry Truman a memo. It started with the following sentence, quote, "Within 4 months, we shall in all probability have completed the most terrible weapon ever known in human history, one bomb of which could destroy a whole city." The memo revealed the existence of what would be known as the Manhattan Project and its goal to develop nuclear weapons. The program was begun by President Franklin D. Roosevelt years earlier after he received a letter from famed scientist Albert Einstein warning him that the Nazis were trying to build an atomic bomb. Stimson's memo said that no other nation would be able to construct a similar bomb for a few years, and it warned in the gravest terms that, quote, "the world in its present state of moral advancement, compared with its technical development, would be eventually at the mercy of such a weapon." In other words, it said, quote, "modern civilization might be completely destroyed." You wonder what Harry Truman was thinking in that moment. He had been born in 1884, in the era of horse and buggy, when railway was the fastest mode of transportation, before the commercialization of automobiles, the advent of flight, the creation of X-rays and radios, and before Einstein discovered relativity. He had lived to see all of those milestones through one of the greatest eras of technological achievement in history. And here he was learning that mankind, specifically his country, was on the verge of something even more momentous. It was about to harness the power of the basic building block of the universe, that of the atom, and it was doing it for the purposes of war. It might unlock for mankind more power than it had ever had before. It was a possibility that was both promising and unsettling. In an age of ever-increasing advancement, it must have struck him that mankind was entering a new era, the nuclear era. It may have crossed his mind that how that era would turn out would likely rest on his shoulders, on a man of such humble beginnings. Stimson later said that Truman discussed the possibility that the bomb could alter human history, but focused on the more immediate possibility that it could end the war. With that, Truman ordered Stimson to form a committee to advise Truman on just what to do with this terrifying new weapon. Events in Europe moved quickly. On April 28th, Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator who fought on the side of the Axis, was executed. Just 2 days later, on April 30th, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. On May 2nd, Berlin fell to Soviet forces. and on May 7th came the news millions had waited for. German forces had surrendered. The European war was over. President Truman announced the news at a press conference the following day, which just happened to be his 61st birthday.
President Truman announced the official surrender.
This is a solemn but glorious hour. I wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to see this day. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe. For this victory, we join in offering our thanks to the Providence which has guided and sustained us through the dark days of adversity and into light. Much remains to be done. The victory won in the West must now be won in the East. The whole world must be cleansed of the evil from which half the world has been free. United, the peace-loving nations have demonstrated in the West that their arms are stronger by far than the might of dictators or the tyranny of military cliques that once called us soft and weak. The power of our peoples to defend themselves against all enemies will be proved in the Pacific War as it was proved in Europe.
With the war in Europe over, it looked like the Allies could now focus exclusively on Japan. But Winston Churchill was worried what this could mean for Europe. As the Soviets strengthened its grip on Eastern Europe and took over more of Germany, he worried about the United States leaving Europe too quickly. Only America could serve as a counterweight to the Soviets. If it left, Stalin might be able to conquer the rest of the continent. Europeans would have been liberated from one totalitarian dictator, only to find itself under the yoke of another. He feared, too, that America and Britain's bargaining position with Stalin could diminish in the event of a pullout. So Churchill began sending Truman messages encouraging him to maintain forces in Europe. But Truman still had a war to fight in Asia. He faced the dilemma. What was the right balance of troops to keep Europe safe from the Soviets, but also enough to defeat the Japanese in Asia? Truman also wanted to show the Soviet Union that the United States would act in good faith, that it would keep its commitments at Yalta. Even though he hoped to be firm on the Soviets, he still held out hope that they could work together in the post-war world. So in early June 1945, he decided to withdraw a significant number of American forces in Europe to send to Japan. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had masterminded the invasion at Normandy a year earlier, agreed with his decision. At this point, you get the sense that Truman was really hoping to work with Stalin in the same way that FDR did. Yes, he had given Molotov a stern talking to, but he felt that cooperation was a real possibility. In fact, in a note on June 7, 1945, Truman wrote, quote, "I'm not afraid of Russia. They've always been our friends, and I can't see any reason why we shouldn't always be." At the same time, Truman had no illusions about Stalin, the man who had butchered millions of his own citizens, whether via purges or through famine-induced policies. In the same note, he wrote of Stalin's use of concentration camps and that the Soviet government, quote, "is no different from the Tsar or Hitler. But I don't care what they do. They evidently like their government, or they wouldn't die for it. I like ours, so let's get along." To some, this is proof that Truman was naive, but to others, he was being realistic about who America had to work with in a world where totalitarian governments were a reality. Truman would later be criticized for being soft on communism in the same way FDR was. And while there are valid arguments for this, it's important to remember that Eisenhower and George Marshall, too, felt that working with the Soviets at this point was possible. Perhaps it was because they felt America needed Russia against Japan. They desperately wanted Russian help to reduce the amount of American casualties in the Pacific theater. Or maybe it was because they had spent the last few years working with Soviet military officials against the Nazis, forming a bond during the grueling experiences of war. Either way, Harry Truman would usher in a kind of dualistic policy towards the Soviets, one that his successors would follow. On the one hand, Truman would talk tough against the communists, but on the other hand, at the risk of looking like an appeaser, he would look to opportunities for cooperation. The atomic bomb, of course, changed the calculus here. From late April to July 1945, a series of meetings and debates took place at the highest levels of the American government that explored the implications of nuclear technology. Of course, the United States didn't have the atomic bomb yet. It hadn't been tested. But scientists were confident that they were almost there. If they would be able to pull it off, the entire strategic landscape, the whole world would shift. You have to think about the context to understand how the people at the time perceived the development of the bomb. For Harry Truman, the main goal was ending the war. Everyone wanted to end the war. You have to remember what people at the time had been through, especially the soldiers. For the previous 6 years, the world had been engaged in a war that involved brutal fighting. But this wasn't just any war. It was one that was waged by totalitarian dictators, by men with no regard for human life, like Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese War Cabinet, to say nothing of America's ally, Joseph Stalin. These dictators had waged total wars against whole populations. Civilians were treated as combatants. Atrocities were perpetrated against men, women, and children. Cities were bombed out. Villages were burned to the ground. Tens of millions of people had been killed. The entire European continent, as well as much of Asia, had been laid waste. Almost all of Western civilization and a lot of Eastern civilization were in shambles. The United States and the Allies were fighting enemies that refused to adhere to the boundaries of civilized warfare. They could also force their own armies and populations to endure misery that stretched the capacity of human suffering. Nazi and Japanese soldiers and their civilians were willing to endure extreme levels of agony and sacrifice, often willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. These were regimes that were willing to risk national suicide rather than surrender. So the Allied powers found themselves in the position where they might have to inflict the maximum level of pain to force their enemies to capitulate. And think of what this all meant for an American soldier. Now, I'm not trying to compare this with the suffering of British or Russian or Polish soldiers. It's a well-known fact that American casualties were several orders of magnitude lower than those experienced by other nations. But war is still war. It still has a cost for everyone involved. The Americans had their own perspective on the war. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, was the greatest amphibious invasion in history. After days of bloody fighting, the Allied force broke through and liberated France. Hitler had surrendered. Imagine the euphoria that erupted from that news. Millions celebrated the end of the war in Europe, but Japan was still holding out. Thousands of soldiers were returning from Europe after surviving the war against Hitler. And yet, many of those same soldiers were now preparing to be deployed to the Pacific. Imagine being one of those soldiers. You had just survived the Nazi war machine, but now you were being told to prepare to be sent to another, perhaps even more horrific front. At that very moment, American service members were fighting in the Battle of Okinawa. You can't understate just how ferocious that fighting was. The Japanese, both soldier and civilian, hid in caves and fought to the last man. They unleashed waves of kamikaze attacks. They even drafted middle school boys to the front of the line. As the Americans and Japanese clashed for every inch of the island, bodies piled up on both sides. As they decomposed, they were covered in maggots. It was truly hell on earth. In less than 3 months, the Americans suffered over 80,000 casualties, while the Japanese suffered over 100,000. Some estimates indicate that there were 100,000 civilian casualties in Okinawa. You have to also remember that the Allies had been firebombing both the Nazis and the Japanese. These bombs were designed specifically to start firestorms that would spread out and burn down whole cities, and they were targeted towards civilian areas. Although the Americans tried not to bomb civilians early in the war, it became harder not to attack them because war manufacturing occurred near or in Japanese residential areas. Starting in the middle of 1944, American B-29s conducted raids over the Japanese homeland. On March 9th and 10th, 279 B-29s dropped 16,000 tons of explosives, including napalm bombs, that burned 16 square miles of Tokyo to the ground. About 100,000 Japanese are estimated to have died. It's hard to read these things without wincing at the hellish realities of war. On one hand, there is no celebrating the enormous destruction of life, especially civilian life. There are photos of bodies that have been burned so thoroughly during the firebombing beyond recognition. But at the same time, the Americans felt such actions were necessary for a reason. Whether you agree with it or not, they did it for a reason. They had heard of the atrocities the Japanese had committed throughout Asia, specifically in China and in the Philippines. These atrocities made no distinction between military personnel and civilians. They involved mass rapes and killings. They involved babies being bayoneted and tossed into the streets. They involved unspeakable torture of POWs. For the Americans, the shock of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was still fresh, as was the treatment of POWs under Japanese control. For them, a nation that was guilty of such atrocities forfeited the right to civilized warfare. Even more frightening to American military officials was the fact that Japan showed little to no desire for surrender. Despite the firebombing raids, Japanese morale did not seem to wane. Okinawa in particular was fresh in their minds. There the Japanese fought to every last person, no matter how dire their situation was. It didn't seem that anything, even the most extreme amount of pressure, could force the Japanese to surrender. In this context, American officials began planning the invasion of the Japanese islands. It was to be called Operation Downfall, and it had a two-phased plan. The first phase would commence in November with an invasion on the southernmost island of Japan, Kyushu. The second phase would start in March 1946 with an invasion of Honshu, the main island of Japan. It would begin with an aerial bombing campaign beyond what anyone had ever seen up to that point. It would exceed the number of bombs dropped against Germany during the previous several years, followed then by a land invasion. The American military estimated 250,000 casualties. Secretary Stimson feared that the actual number might be 1 million. Think about that for a second. Anywhere from 250,000 to 1 million casualties. Casualties incurred, possibly in horrific hand-to-hand combat, fighting for every inch of territory. Until then, the United States had incurred about 400,000 deaths. So for American planners, an invasion of Japan meant that the worst might yet be to come. For those planners, the atomic bomb represented a way out. But given the loss of life the Japanese had already incurred, would it guarantee their surrender? Stimson and his committee, the S-1 Committee, met several times in the spring and summer of 1945. Their job was to develop recommendations for the president on the use of the bomb. Stimson knew the importance of what they were doing. He impressed upon his fellow members that the bomb was not just, quote, a new weapon merely, but as a revolutionary change in the relations of man to the universe, and feared it might be, quote, the doom of civilization. The bomb was not something they took lightly. Given what they knew about the Japanese, Stimson felt nothing short of, quote, a tremendous shock could carry convincing proof of our power to destroy the empire. He felt that, quote, such an effective shock would save many times the number of lives, both American and Japanese, that it would cost. Sometimes when I hear people debate about whether we should have used the bomb, it seems to them that the choice was between using the bomb and not using the bomb. But I think that this rendering is a bit incomplete. The choice was actually between using a bomb that would kill thousands or hundreds of thousands of Japanese relatively quickly, or commencing an invasion which could mean the death of hundreds of thousands more, maybe even millions, in the ugliest, drawn-out combat the world would yet see. With the bomb, you had the hope that the war would end sooner. In an invasion, you could expect that the war could last another year, if not longer, and could lead to hundreds of thousands of American deaths. It was not an option between good and bad. It was one between bad and worse. And if you just lived through the worst war in history, would you not have considered using it, especially if you knew of the cruel methods the Japanese used in the war? The other question that came up was whether or not it would be possible to use the bomb without actually killing anyone, that is, demonstrating the bomb to the Japanese in the hopes that they would surrender so we wouldn't have to actually use it on them. Now, this is where the argument gets more complicated, and there are very valid views on both sides. But Stimson's committee ultimately ruled against this option. The reason? They felt that it was too risky. The committee members believed that a demonstration might not have the same impact, might not create that, quote, tremendous shock that an actual attack would have. If the Japanese hadn't surrendered after the Americans killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians through firebombing, would they surrender if they witnessed a pre-planned demonstration? And there was another fear, that the bomb might not work. They hadn't yet tested the bomb. If the bomb, for whatever reason, failed during the demonstration, it would be a national humiliation. It would embolden the Japanese further. It would have the opposite effect of prolonging the war. And it wasn't as if the United States had multiple bombs. They were still manufacturing the first few. As Oppenheimer said, quote, "We can propose no technical demonstration likely to bring an end to the war. We see no acceptable alternatives to direct military use." It should be noted that not everyone agreed with the committee's recommendation. One of Truman's advisors, John McCloy, suggested that America give the warning to the Japanese about the bomb to tell them what the bomb could do. He also brought up a topic of importance to the Japanese, that the United States should promise the Japanese that they could keep their emperor. It was assumed by many, if the Japanese lost, their leaders, including the emperor, would be tried and maybe executed for war crimes. Perhaps if America would let the Japanese keep the emperor, the man they considered a god, they might surrender sooner. If America did this, if it warned them and let them keep the emperor, America might have a stronger moral position than if they ended up using the bomb. At least America could say that they had warned the Japanese. Truman heard out McCloy, but made no further decision. At this point, the Japanese hadn't given any sign of capitulating, but there were some signs of a peace faction within the government in Tokyo. Their foreign affairs minister, Shigenori Togo, sent a message to the Japanese ambassador to the Soviet Union, floating an idea that the Russians might mediate an end to the war. But that ambassador responded, saying the Russians weren't interested at all in ending the war, and affirmed the demand that Japan surrender unconditionally. Tokyo then messaged that ambassador not to agree to any promise for unconditional surrender. Historian David McCullough writes that these exchanges were intercepted by American intelligence officials and sent to President Truman. We do not know what the president thought about them. While all of this was going on, Truman was preparing for his first major test on the world stage. In the previous 4 years, the leaders of the Allied nations had met several times to discuss planning the war and the post-war world. Obviously, the most famous of those meetings was the Yalta Conference. Well, the Allies were planning to meet again, this time in July in Potsdam, Germany, and Truman would be taking President Roosevelt's place. Potsdam was a city near Berlin, so on the way there, Truman got to see the newly conquered capital city. What he saw was absolute destruction, a city laid waste by Allied bombings, the result of total war. The meeting would last from July 17th to the beginning of August. There were 3 big issues to talk about. The first was the future of Eastern Europe, especially Poland. As I said earlier, the British and the Americans were hoping for free elections in Poland, but that was looking unlikely as the Soviets tightened their grip. Second was the future of Germany. This was the nation that was at the center of both world wars. The victors wanted to ensure that Germany would never threaten them again. Back at Yalta, it was agreed that Germany would be dismembered into zones of occupation, with America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union claiming different zones. And third was finalizing Soviet entry into the war against Japan, which Stalin had promised at Yalta. For Truman, who had an idea of how costly a Japanese invasion would be, this was his top objective. You can imagine what Truman must have been thinking at this time. FDR, Churchill, and Stalin were larger-than-life figures who had long been on the world stage. And here was Truman, the accidental president, the new kid on the block. And he had almost no foreign policy experience. The thought of going toe-to-toe with these men must have seemed like a daunting task. He later admitted to his wife that he was terrified. But as impressive as these men were, they were only human. And that was clear to Truman immediately after meeting them. When Truman first met Churchill at the conference, he admitted that he was, quote, a most charming and very clever person. But Truman believed he saw through the charm. Quote, he gave me a lot of hooey about how great my country is. I am sure we can get along if he doesn't try to give me too much soft soap. And when Truman met Stalin, he noticed something that most people, even today, don't know about him, that he was short. Thanks to Soviet propaganda, most of our images portray Stalin as a man of intimidating and impressive stature, but in reality, he was about 5'6". The ruthless, totalitarian leader of international communism was, as Truman called him, quote, a little bit of a squirt. You think about how Napoleon gets a lot of grief for being short when he was 5'7", which was about average for Frenchmen back then. During the rest of the Potsdam Conference, the Allies reaffirmed their plan to divide up Germany into occupation zones. Although Truman and Churchill pressed Stalin on Poland, the fact was that the Soviets were in control of Poland, and the government they imposed there was there to stay. For Truman and Churchill, the only way to change things in Poland was to use force to expel the Soviets from Eastern Europe, and after years of war, no one was willing to do that. Around this time, an event occurred that changed the world. At 5:29 a.m. on July 16th, a flash of light was seen in a desert in New Mexico. It came from an explosion, the equivalent of 20,000 tons of TNT. Desert sand instantly melted, and the shock wave traveled over 100 miles away. Within minutes, a mushroom cloud had risen almost 8 miles. The United States had successfully detonated the first atomic bomb in history. 2 days later, at the Potsdam Conference, Truman received word of the successful test. It was the news that he had been waiting for. The president and his advisors knew that the world had entered a new era, the atomic age. The genie was out of the bottle. Whatever the implications of this, in the short term, it meant a possible end to the war against Japan. Using it could make an invasion of the Japanese home islands unnecessary. It could save American lives. Heck, some of the Americans thought that it could save Japanese lives too. And it could give some ancillary benefits. It might even give Truman leverage in the negotiations, especially against the Soviets. I mean, America alone had the nuclear monopoly. Stimson wrote that Truman's demeanor at the conference, quote, tremendously pepped up, and that it, quote, gave him an entirely new confidence. There is no evidence that Truman seriously considered not using the bomb. It seems he wanted to avoid an invasion as much as possible. McCullough notes that Truman was among the very few presidents in the 20th century to have actually experienced combat on the ground, as he did in World War I. There he got a taste of the vicious and futile trench warfare that characterized the war. He knew what that kind of combat would entail. He got estimates from the military that an invasion would result in 250,000 to 1 million casualties. He believed that the Japanese would fight to every last person, which they demonstrated at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. In his eyes, this left him no choice but to drop the bomb. He felt so strongly that it was almost not really a decision. His British ally Winston Churchill later wrote, quote, "The decision whether or not to use the atomic bomb to compel the surrender of Japan was never an issue. There was unambiguous, automatic, unquestioned agreement around our table, nor did I ever hear the slightest suggestion that we should do otherwise." While at the conference, Truman decided to mention the development of the bomb to Stalin, which he did in the vaguest of terms. One can speculate the impact Truman hoped that it would have on the Soviet dictator. Truman told him that the United States had, quote, a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Perhaps the president was hoping for some interesting response, some slight hint of concern. If that's what he hoped for, he would end up being disappointed. When Stalin heard the news, he played it cool. He more or less just shrugged it off. It was almost as if he didn't care. He didn't ask anything more about the new weapon. He just made some side comment that he hoped that it would help against the Japanese. Truman was puzzled, but looking back with what we know now, it makes sense. Stalin was already well aware about the bomb and the American nuclear project. Soviet spies were well entrenched in the United States. One of those men, a man named Klaus Fuchs, was involved in the Manhattan Project and had supplied Moscow with information about its progress. At any rate, on July 26th, the Potsdam Declaration was released. It was designed for ambiguity, perhaps to give the Allies flexibility in dealing with Japan after the war. It also specified unconditional surrender. But there was a subtle change of language. It said that the Japanese armed forces, not necessarily the nation, would be required to surrender. Perhaps it was to provide leeway for the country as a whole, perhaps allowing them to maintain their emperor. The declaration made no mention of the emperor specifically. It also promised that the alternative facing Japan was, quote, prompt and utter destruction. Some scholars today interpret this as a warning about the atomic bomb. The Japanese ignored the declaration. U.S. aircraft dropped millions of leaflets with the declaration on the Japanese homeland. By July 31st, Truman gave the United States military final approval to use the atomic bomb against Japan. Then he headed home on a ship called the USS Augusta. Truman's top advisors, including Bolin and Harriman, gave the president high marks for his performance at Potsdam. According to Bolin, quote, he was never defeated or made to look foolish in debate. It wasn't a bad performance for someone who had virtually no preparation in international statesmanship. On the way back, Truman spent some time with members of the press. On August 3rd, aboard the Augusta, he chatted with a small group of reporters that he specifically selected. Truman felt that he could trust them over anyone else in the press. During their time together, Truman dropped a bombshell, so to speak. He mentioned that the United States had the atomic bomb and that its use against Japan was pending. I wonder what those reporters were thinking when they heard this, especially since they were men whose professions were based on being the first to get the big scoop and to publish it for the world to see. They were among the few in the entire world to know about this momentous bit of information. Back in Potsdam, Truman had been giddy over the prospect of using the bomb to end the war. But now things began to sink in. As he returned home, he was, according to some reports, a bit more grave. Sometimes I've heard people describe Truman as a man who didn't understand the significance of dropping the bomb. I'm not so sure. He knew he had an awesome responsibility, and he brooded over its consequences. United Press reporter Merriman Smith wrote, quote, he was happy and thankful that we had a weapon in our hands which would speed the end of the war, but he was apprehensive over the development of such a monstrous weapon of destruction. Over the next few days, Smith described Truman's mood as tense. On 8:15 a.m., August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay dropped a nuclear fission device, nicknamed Little Boy, over the city of Hiroshima. Moments later, it detonated about 1,900 feet above the ground, releasing 16,000 tons of TNT. In seconds, about 60 to 80,000 people lost their lives. Men, women, children, the elderly, soldiers, and civilians. The fireball that erupted from the blast is estimated at over 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. To give you some idea of this, lava can reach up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature where rock melts. Nanoseconds after the explosion, human beings were incinerated instantly. Most of them had no idea what was coming. Their shadows left imprints on the ground. The flash generated from the bomb itself, not just the explosion, but just the flash of light released, was hot enough to burn human skin and retinas from miles away. The blast of the bomb rippled from ground zero, flattening buildings and shattering glass. People were either crushed by concrete or struck by shards of glass and debris all over their bodies. Neutron and gamma radiation pulsated from the fireball, exposing human beings to lethal doses. A later U.S. government report estimated that in one instant, Little Boy released the same amount of explosive firepower as 220 B-29 bombers carrying 1,200 tons of incendiary bombs, 400 tons of high explosive bombs, and 500 tons of anti-personnel fragmentation bombs. A few years ago, I went to Hiroshima to see the site and the Peace Museum near Ground Zero that commemorates the attack. Two things stick out in my memory. The first was a gravestone marker that had survived the bomb's detonation. It was on a side street near Ground Zero, and it featured the marble figure of an ancient Japanese deity sitting on a marble platform. You could just go up to it and touch it. I was pretty amazed that you could touch something that had survived the bomb. You could see the shadow of the marble figure burned onto the platform and see how the rest of the surface had been burned off by the heat of the bomb. I thought about how that gravestone marker had sat there on the morning of August 6, 1945, surrounded by thousands of people who had no idea of their own impending death. And there it was today for anyone to just look at and touch. The second thing that struck me was the Peace Museum in Hiroshima, all the artifacts that were there. There were twisted bicycles that survived the blast. There were large steel doors that had been warped by the force and the heat of the bomb, crumpled up as if they were aluminum foil. There were packs of glass bottles that had been melted and fused together and looked like a glass honeycomb. There were strips of burned material. They looked like burned paper, but when you read about them, it turned out that they were burned remains of human beings, sometimes school children, burned pieces of flesh, skin, fingernails, maybe burned pieces of clothing that had infused with human skin. There were long slabs of concrete, some of which had shadows etched on them, shadows of Japanese people who were burned onto the ground. And we haven't even talked about the suffering that would result from the bomb. The stories of people walking like zombies with their burned skin hanging off them. The stories of those who somehow survived but were burned beyond recognition. Of those who would slowly die agonizing deaths over the next few days, months, and years because of their burns, their wounds, and the radiation that had altered their cells. The story of those who, badly burned and dehydrated, rejoiced when they saw rain fall from the sky, but had no idea that it was highly radioactive. In the weeks, months, and years ahead, hundreds of thousands more people would suffer or die from the after effects. Harry Truman never imagined that he would make the decision to unleash this level of destruction on anyone. He never asked for it. He didn't even know about the bomb until just a few weeks earlier. But the revolutionary power of the bomb itself, the level of destruction and human misery it released, what it meant, the giant technological leap that it symbolized, all of these things would now forever be associated with Harry Truman. He got news of the detonation at noon on the 6th as his ship neared Newfoundland. The message from Secretary Stimson reported, quote, "Results clear-cut successful in all respects, visible effects greater than in any test." Another message came in, which said, quote, "First reports indicate complete success." Truman was overjoyed. To a military officer, he said, quote, "This is the greatest thing in history." As news spread throughout the ship, there was a sense that the war might really end soon. That day, President Truman read a statement to the American people announcing the dawn of a new age.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July the 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware.
News of the Hiroshima bombs swept across the nation and the world. Soldiers and their families celebrated the possibility that it might mean the end of the war, especially those who had survived the war in Europe and were expecting to be deployed to Japan. But others feared what it all meant. Mankind had now reached a new threshold of destruction. The world now had a weapon that could destroy whole cities. Now that the atomic genie was out, there was no telling what the future would hold. Remember, the people at the time had lived through the worst war in history, and many of them had lived through World War I. They had lived through the two most destructive wars ever. Many recalled how the world's powers tried to prevent another world war from happening after the first one, and they had failed miserably. Who was to say that a third world war wouldn't happen, especially with the Soviet Union challenging the West? And now humanity learned how to unleash the powers hidden in the atom. Admiral William Leahy, top advisor to Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, wrote, quote, "The lethal possibilities of such atomic action in the future is frightening, and while we are the first to have it in our possession, there is a certainty that it will in the future be developed by potential enemies and that it will probably be used against us." For the next couple of days, the world waited anxiously for word from Tokyo. Would they surrender? All they had was radio silence. Some of Truman's advisors feared that the atomic bomb had failed to shock the Japanese into surrender. What would it take? More bombings? Truman had delegated to the military use of the bomb, so a second bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, was being prepared. Its primary target was the city of Kokura. Around this time, Truman spoke to the American people, explaining his decision to use the bomb.
The British, Chinese, and United States governments have given the Japanese people adequate warning of what is in store for them. We have laid down the general terms on which they can surrender. Our warning went unheeded. Our terms were rejected. Since then, the Japanese have seen what our atomic bomb can do. They can foresee what it will do in the future. The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. That was because we wished in the first attack to avoid, insofar as possible, the killing of civilians. But that attack is only a warning of things to come. If Japan does not surrender, bombs will have to be dropped on her war industries, and unfortunately, thousands of civilian lives will be lost. I urge Japanese civilians to leave industrial cities immediately and save themselves from destruction. I realize the tragic significance of the atomic bomb. Its production and its use were not lightly undertaken by this government, but we knew that our enemies were on the search for it. We know now how close they were to finding it. And we knew the disaster which would come to this nation and to all peace-loving nations, to all civilization, if they had found it first. That is why we felt compelled to undertake the long and uncertain and costly labor of discovery and production. We won the race of discovery against the Germans. Having found the bomb, we have used it. We have used it against those who attack us without warning at Pearl Harbor, against those who have starved and beaten and executed American prisoners of war, against those who have abandoned all pretense of obeying international laws of warfare. We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans. We shall continue to use it until we completely destroy Japan's power to make war. Only a Japanese surrender will stop us.
On August 9th, the B-29, nicknamed Boxcar, flew the Fat Man bomb to Kokura, but the crew found it obscured by smoke from firebombing raids on a nearby city and from factory smoke. Instead, Boxcar headed towards its secondary target, the city of Nagasaki. This bomb, a plutonium bomb, was even stronger than the bomb that hit Hiroshima. It detonated with a force of around 21 kilotons, or 21,000 tons of TNT. Another 20 to 80,000 Japanese were killed. Earlier that day, the Soviet Union had declared war against Japan, and invaded Manchuria with 100,000 soldiers. Manchuria was the part of China that Japan had conquered. The Japanese, having lost 2 cities to atomic bombs, were now faced with a two-front war against 2 of the strongest countries on Earth. For all they knew, the United States might have even more atomic bombs. One American POW had told the Japanese that America had 100 atomic bombs left. Although this wasn't true at all, and it would take another 2 weeks for another bomb to be ready, the Japanese had no way to confirm it. With the situation so dire, you might have expected Japan to surrender. After the bombing of Hiroshima, Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki and Foreign Minister Togo Shigenori were already convinced that the Japanese had to surrender. But Japan's top military officials refused to budge. In fact, the Minister of War, Korochika Anami, preferred national suicide to preserve the nation's honor rather than surrender, saying, quote, "Would it not be wondrous for this whole nation to be destroyed like a beautiful flower?" Even after the Japanese government received word of the Nagasaki bombing and the Soviet invasion, they refused to surrender according to the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The cabinet deadlocked between those who supported surrender and those who refused. At least 4 meetings took place with the Japanese cabinet, and the deadlock continued. Even after losing 2 cities to atomic warfare and the prospect of a 2-front war, and the possibility that America had enough atomic bombs to destroy all of Japanese civilization, its government still couldn't come to a consensus for surrender. Finally, on August 10th, in desperation, Prime Minister Suzuki asked the emperor to intervene. Only he had the clout to tip the government one way or another. The emperor then said the following, quote, "I have given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad, and have concluded that continuing the war can only mean destruction for the nation and the prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty in the world. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. It goes without saying that it is unbearable for me to see the brave and loyal fighting men of Japan disarmed. It is equally unbearable that others who have rendered me devoted service should now be punished as instigators of the war. Nevertheless, the time has come to bear the unbearable. I swallow my tears and give my sanction to the proposal to accept the Allied proclamation on the basis outlined by the foreign minister." With that, the Japanese finally accepted the Potsdam Declaration. They insisted, though, that the emperor should stay. Although some back and forth ensued on whether to accept this, ultimately, Truman agreed. He wanted the killing to stop. After Nagasaki, Truman withdrew the military's authority to use the bomb again. Truman also said to a senator, quote, "I also have a human feeling for the women and children of Japan." At a cabinet meeting, he said that the thought of wiping out another city was too horrible, and that all he kept thinking of were, quote, "all those kids." On August 14, 1945, Japan officially surrendered. But that didn't mean everyone in the Japanese government was ready to accept defeat. In fact, several hundred, if not 1,000 or so officials from the Japanese War Ministry and the Imperial Guard were plotting a coup to occupy the Imperial Palace and arrest the emperor. The plotters, led by one Major Kenji Hatanaka, killed a number of people in the attempt and tried to find and destroy a recorded copy of the emperor's surrender speech, which was to be broadcast across the country. They were hoping they could inspire officers in the army to rise up and prevent the surrender. The rebels learned soon enough that there wasn't support in the army for their plans. Many of those rebels then committed suicide. In the midst of the attempted coup, a recording of the speech had been smuggled out of the palace in a laundry basket of women's underwear. It was broadcast to the nation the following day. At last, the worst war in history was over. Harry Truman hoped that the bomb would render an invasion unnecessary, and it did just that. The world celebrated as it never had before.
The day of days for America and her allies. Crowds before the White House await the announcement from the President that the Japs have surrendered unconditionally.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government
in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification.
Reporters rush out to relay the news to an anxious world and touch off celebrations throughout the country. Washington is jubilant, and in Chicago, more than 1 million sing and dance in the streets in the biggest celebration the Windy City has ever seen. Joy is unconfined.
On September 2nd, 1945, Japanese officials signed the surrender documents on board the USS Missouri, formally marking the end of World War II. They had expected to suffer at the hands of the victor, to be shamed and humiliated, as the vanquished usually are throughout history. One Japanese diplomat present, Toshikazu Kase, later wrote about how he felt during the ceremony, quote, "I tried to preserve the dignity of defeat, but it was difficult, and every minute seemed to contain ages. A lump rose in my throat, and tears quickly gathered in my eyes, flooding them. I could hardly bear the sight." General Douglas MacArthur began to speak.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding. A world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan.
It's easy for us today to hear these words and see them as eloquent pablum, but for the Japanese, they were stunning. MacArthur went on to talk about the potential of the Japanese to rise above their present posture of defeat. Kase wrote of his American counterparts, quote, "Here is the victor announcing the verdict to the prostrate enemy. He can impose a humiliating penalty if he so desires. And yet he pleads for freedom, tolerance, and justice. For me, who expected the worst humiliation, this was a complete surprise. I was thrilled beyond words, spellbound, thunderstruck." Kase would later consider what would have happened had the situation been reversed. Quote, "I raised the question whether it would have been possible for us, had we been victorious, to embrace the vanquished with a similar magnanimity. Clearly, it would have been different." And yet, the debate about how it ended continues, a debate that continues to define Harry Truman's historical legacy. To this day, many still wonder, was the bomb necessary? I don't intend to get into the exact details of this debate or convince you either way. I've already provided the context for the decision, the long years of atrocities that the Japanese had committed throughout Asia and against civilians and soldiers alike, the sense that the Japanese would not surrender. Heck, they hadn't surrendered after the firebombings, which most historians say killed more people than did the atomic bombs. For many decades, there was a strong consensus that Truman made the right call. In 1945, a Gallup poll immediately after the war indicated 85% of Americans believed that it was the right thing to do. That consensus is disappearing. By 2015, Pew Research reported that 56% of Americans now believe that it was justified. To some, by dropping the bomb, Harry Truman essentially committed a crime against humanity. But the fact remains, even after a year of firebombings and island warfare, after 2 cities were wiped out by atomic bombs, and after the invasion by the Soviet Union, the Japanese hadn't conclusively surrendered. The Allies had no guarantee that the war would end and that the killing would stop. They had no guarantee that an invasion wouldn't be necessary. For all they knew, they might have to drop more atomic bombs and wipe out more cities to end the war. And they had no idea that at least one major Japanese official, Minister of War Anami, dreamed of a final grand battle in which the Japanese people committed the equivalent of national suicide. It took the emperor, a man regarded as a deity, to to force the government to accept a surrender. Some may look at this and still believe that the atomic bomb was not justified, that perhaps a demonstration would have gotten the Japanese to quit, or that the U.S., for moral reasons, should have been willing to shoulder the load of an invasion no matter how horrific it would have been. But at least for now, a majority of Americans believe Truman made the right call. And yet, even for those who believe that it was the right choice, you're awakened to something sobering. That at one moment in history, the world was at such a point that using the bomb and inflicting that kind of destruction was actually the better of the two options. It leads one to ask, if that was the better option, what does it say about humanity? What does it say about us as a species? But the important thing at that moment was that the war was finally over. Harry Truman had only been in office for half a year, but he was already presiding over one of the most consequential times in history, one that saw the end of the most destructive conflict in history. It was, for many Americans, their country's greatest moment. The president's approval ratings were sky high, well into the high 80s. Americans couldn't wait to get back to their normal lives. But challenges loomed ahead. The nation was about to transition into a new peacetime economy. It hadn't experienced a normal economy since before the Great Depression. The atomic genie was out of the bottle. Harry Truman, for the rest of his life, would live with the decision he made to use it on his fellow human beings. And the Allies, now victorious, were arguing over unsettled business. It had been a momentous first few months, but Harry Truman's problems were really just beginning. The rest of his story is the subject of the next episode of This American President. If you want to learn more about today's episode, check out Truman by David McCullough, The Making of the Atomic Bomb by Richard Rhodes, and Strategies of Containment by John Lewis Gaddis. Today's episode is the start of a multi-part series on presidents during the Cold War. We also wanted to thank our Patreon supporters, especially Paul and Ann Olson from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, for their very generous gift. You too can support us by going to patreon.com/thisamericanpresident and giving any amount you choose per episode we release. If you like what you've been hearing, you can help us by sharing our episode on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Richard Lim, and we're back next time for more This American President.